Good afternoon. Welcome to part 2 of the Bloodborne preview and analysis by Tweedy Gamer speaking. Hello everyone. I hope you've been well this past day. Now, let's get on right to it. When I finished last night's podcast, it was on the note of early and contemporary inspirations, and some very brief, comparatively, segment, some exploration on the setting of Bloodborne. This video will be centering around a bit of story speculation and some comments and some insights into the world design. Now, a couple of months back, when they first released I think it was the second gameplay trailer, or perhaps the first, when we saw essentially what's come to be known as the classic, the iconic battle between the hunter and the cleric beast on the bridge in, I believe it's the upper rises of Yharnam. There's a few important things just within this setting, within this event, this premise that we can sort of freeze frame, so to speak, and go across the setting and talk about the various different elements, including character design, that's tapping into the world design, and I just figured I'd use this very recognizable vignette to open up both of these subjects. Now, where I left off, we hadn't entirely finished talking about the setting, so I'll just spend a bit of time talking about that. In addition to the architectural style, which is clearly influenced by 19th century Edinburgh, you're looking at some elements of medieval going into Dickensian London, which has an old history, that city, and there are different stages of its layout and its architectural style, which have been clearly appropriated. There was a podcast recently by, I believe it was IGN Pubcast, and they spoke about, I think one of the female reviewer there, she mentioned that her 20-minute impression of playing Bloodborne could have been summarized as 19th century England / Scandinavia on crack. Essentially, the setting, which ties into the nightmare theme, I believe, with Bloodborne. Because in nightmares, things are twisted, things are accentuated, and also blown out into grotesquerie, into warped, twisted shapes. So Yharnam, appropriately, is a warped and twisted version of these cities we know, and these vistas, and even some tropes that we know from the genre, which is basically horror, gothic horror. A good 80 to 90% of Bloodborne's vibe, its themes, gothic horror, as discussed in the last podcast, Tweedycast 1, which we talked about H.P. Lovecraft and Bram Stoker. Now, the main takeaway that ties back into the setting, and that the vignette of the cleric beast facing off against the hunter, which has a bit of a build-up to it. Initially, as you've all seen, I'm sure, with that gameplay video, climbing that ladder, hearing that screech, that is straight out of a novel. That's straight out of a gothic horror novel setting. The shriek, the far-off, distant cry that spins the neck and makes you look towards the moon and look towards, in fright, look towards where the sound is coming from. That is definitely Bloodborne wearing its influences on its sleeve. without a shadow of a doubt. And foreshadowing is another major theme of Gothic horror. In fact, it makes it one of the most effective aspects that you can include, that many authors have included in their Gothic horror stories. There's the foreshadowing, the heavy use of foreshadowing in Dracula, which, again, even though it's a bit unrealistic to expect that a few people would mind being spoiled, I'll still be quite cautious when it comes to it, because I would not want to have any aspect of these classic novels spoiled to me, even though it seems to be quite usual for people to just openly discuss the elements, assuming the elements of the book, assuming that everyone has read them already. But there's, needless to say, a heavy use of foreshadowing in Dracula. And it obviously takes place on starless nights with fog everywhere. Just saying these words, bringing up that setting, evoking that setting is enough to enrapture either a reader or a viewer, or now with Bloodborne players. We take it for granted, and we just sometimes fold it into the rest of the elements of the game that we're honing in on and paying attention to and appreciating. But this particular setting, like the horror genre, is one of the most enrapturing and immersive genres, because it taps into our fear. A natural human inclination with fear is to melt further into it, to give into it. It is really up to our cores, the core of our beings, to be able to yank ourselves out. And what happens with dreams is, because we know rationally that we normally live in the real world, that is our core, that is who we are, and where we go to is nightmares and dreams, and then we return to that core, which is the same thing with a horror movie. You begin in the real world, you enter this nightmare world, and then you can yank yourself out. But in the back of our minds, there's always that feeling, knowing that there's going to be this big tug of the line. We're actually tied at the waist with these narratives and these games. We're wandering out into the darkness and seeing, this is terrifying, this is grotesque. And if you've seen the latest Bloodborne trailer with some of those creatures, they will give people nightmares, without a doubt. But because we know it's part of the premise of the nightmare, it's because we know that we will be coming out of it. It's not something necessarily you think of consciously, that's on your mind throughout the entire experience. But when you're wandering out with your hands outstretched into these dark narratives, these dark settings, these grotesque, monstrous settings, we know we're going to be pulled back from the brink. And so we sort of strain at it. We strain to want to see more. We strain to want to experience more horror, more fear. And Bloodborne really seems to be embracing that and taking that to the next level. Absolutely. I'll use the recently released trailer as an example. It is the launch trailer of Bloodborne. It was released, I believe, after the first Tweetycast, so it can be another point of reference for our discussion today. The trailer opens up with the blood ministration doctor. Just take one look at his hat and you can tell this is a twisted, warped nightmare. And as with all nightmares, a lot of the most horrifying aspects are simply the ones that just don't make sense at all. There are many visuals in that trailer. I don't want to spoil it for you, but there are many glimpses of grotesque, unexplainable horrors in those trailers that just they just blare open your eyes, they blare open your senses, and you become immediately receptive to finding out why, finding out how, knowing that full well in Hidetaka Miyazaki's style that it might not be properly revealed, and it stokes us to want to explore it even more. So the setting and the atmosphere, but focusing more on the setting as we're doing now, they're pillars of a game. They sometimes get folded into world design, sometimes they get folded into aesthetics, but archetypical and sort of primal settings, the the aspects of stories that tap into us on a level that goes beyond video games, that goes beyond what we've been experiencing from a narrative point of view, from an authored point of view. When you tap into that human primal fear, that human primal exploration, you've got something that will be lasting, that will be effective, and Hidetaka absolutely embraces that in his games. Absolutely. So now we'll break apart the trailer in a little moment, but we'll concentrate on this vignette of the cleric beast facing off against the hunter, and I'm thinking more that we'll discuss both sort of organically together, but broadly I will divide this into story speculation initially and world design. Or I might interchange those, we'll see. Now, the bridge itself, the design of Yharnam itself, as I mentioned, is based on these these types of architecture which we've seen in, I'm sure, several films. There are films that pop up immediately off the cuff. We're looking at From Hell with Johnny Depp. We're looking at another one that I should have mentioned in the first video, but this is a major one, Van Helsing. Van Helsing with Hugh Jackman and Kate Beckinsale is one of the least referenced to, but possibly one of the most relevant examples of one of the contemporary inspirations behind Bloodborne's world design, and even in some faint aspects, its story. And those faint aspects, I can describe it in under a minute. Van Helsing is a hunter. You're a hunter. Van Helsing hunts monsters. You hunt monsters. Van Helsing, without being too worried about spoilers for this one, because I'm more certain that more people have seen this film, ironically, or know about it. There's obviously a castle in that film. And the carriage ride, which features so classically and prominently in the latest trailer, I instantly, as soon as I saw that carriage ride, that shot, that underslung shot, classic shot of the carriage's wheel and the very frankly beastly looking horses, drawing that carriage, towards mystery, towards the rest of the story, and what's very likely towards Yharnam, unless it's a flashback featuring other characters. But there has to be a way that you arrive to Yharnam. It can't necessarily just be by foot, although in my story, which is included in the Bloodborne PDF, which I hope you have all downloaded and had a good read of, I might be referencing to it a few times during this and the final part 3 video. Yes, absolutely. The carriage ride absolutely nails it. So, go. Van Helsing, absolutely. And spoiler alert, there are definitely werewolves in Van Helsing, in case you don't know. And the werewolves are possibly the closest cinematic equivalent to Bloodborne's own Lycans, with the raised and elongated legs, with the very canine, very wolf-like face. Very similar. I'll probably have a few comparison pictures during this video for you to see the similarities. Now, so across that bridge, we have a number of interesting, if you're paying attention to that during the video, which I'm sure most people are focusing on the gameplay, on the combat, but there are crashed carriages, there are corpses everywhere, monsters and people. There are weeping statues. All across Yharnam, there are weeping statues. There are statues that really appear to have either been initially sculpted in praise, in celebration of perhaps a belief system or as part of a religion in Yharnam's world, in the Bloodborne universe. And I've done some exploratory speculation about the purpose of the statues and where they come from. I'm sure in Bloodborne, if they're even touched on at all, that perhaps they might be alluded to. But this bridge seems pretty prominent, and the presence of the cleric beast guarding the bridge, as we all know, in horror movies, in horror stories, as well as being the ripest narrative ground for tropes like foreshadowing. What is also a major part of horror is symbolism. Now, there is no doubt that the cleric beast is called a cleric beast for a reason. It is speculated, I believe, in official Bloodborne promotional material, I believe on the PlayStation official site. The small segment on the cleric beast describes it speculatively, of course, as is always the case with Dark Souls and Hidetaka content, and stories and characters. It is speculated very vaguely, very gently, that the cleric beast obviously used to be a cleric, or transforms into a cleric. Cleric ties into religion, which ties into the statues, which ties into the bridge. This bridge is very prominent. It's obviously done for dramatic effect, for, to make an impression on gamers, to have that epic feel. But again, all the best stories, which I'm confident that Hidetaka is creating with Bloodborne, a phenomenal story, and I believe a classic one. There is going to be rich lore, and there's going to be a storyline, and though it might not be spoken about right on the nose and explained completely, and I very much doubt that, that is what these speculation videos are for. It's what the ones that have been made for Dark Souls have been for, and people seem quite content to listen to those and have their imaginations, set alight by the potential of these ideas. And Hidetaka has really tapped into something, another human tendency, which is speculation, which is wonder, and I touched on this in the previous video. I believe, and this is just my initial analysis, that the cleric beast is, apart from cursed by his bestial form, the cleric who he once was obviously had his lodgings not far from the bridge, as is the myth of ghosts, the myth of many folklore creatures, when a damsel is transformed into a fawn, or a man is transformed into a wolf, etc. But more so veering on the ghost myth, which is that ghosts haunt where they were killed, haunt a particularly significant area of the world, place in the world, which ties into who they once were. Yharnam, by its lavishness, by its faded glory, you can see those carriages are incredibly ornate. You can see the structure, the grandioseness of the city. In its former life, Yharnam would have been majestic to behold. It would have been even beyond anything we know in the real world. There are spires, there are buildings upon buildings that have been so, obviously this is game design, and I'm definitely aware of that, but the narrative implication is that these buildings, this city was incredibly well funded. The prime business, as is recounted regularly, even in the early promotional material and marketing material, trailers and such of Bloodborne, is that this city used to be a mecca for the medical practice, and the doctor touches on blood ministration. You can tell by his accent, you can tell by his inflections, you can tell by his vocabulary that he was a learned man, he was a intelligent man, and just simply because he's essentially implied to be a doctor, doctors, medical school, intelligent, very much a citizen, someone who has come from, or possibly even knows what Yharnam used to be like before the curse, before the plague of the beast. The cleric, as we know from history, there has been clashes between religion and science. And it is my speculation that the intermingling, the clashes that happened with these doctors, these healers who began to experiment, who began to push the boundaries. You can see it's implied with the layout of Yharnam, with the grandioseness of Yharnam, that the citizens, the elite of Yharnam, were pushing. They were pushing things. They were taking what they had learned, getting very proud of themselves, and possibly pride turned to arrogance. And there were clashes between the scientists, the medical professionals, and the religious institutions. Now, again, it's worth noting that with these subjects that I put a disclaimer. I am accepting of all faiths, accepting of all belief systems, and believe that it is only the extremists of these belief systems that give all religions a bad name. It's the extremists, it's the strictly human behavior. There's nothing that I am personally at odds with systems of belief that don't impose, as a matter of their doctrine, that don't impose naturally as part of their basic teachings onto people and non-believers, etc. And you'll find in your own, by sort of removing the veil that is placed on us by media, etc., which is, I believe, something that happened in its own way during the Civil War, or whatever that major conflict was that reduced Yharnam to what it was. The mob mentality, the pack mentality that has clearly taken a hold and shows very much in evidence by the sort of degenerate and infected hunters, quote-unquote, marks, because they are turning into beasts themselves. There's a lot of commentary to be had about that, but we won't go too far into that. Needless to say, I believe that I'll tie up what I was saying earlier. Incredibly accepting of all forms of religion, and in no sense, in fact, Hidetaka seems to be doing the same thing. There are no crucifixes in sight. There are no recognizable real-world religious icons in sight that any religious group could possibly take offense to. The reference to cleric obviously implies references to that role, and that role is tied into Christianity. But we'll discuss clerics. They had an administrative role. They had a role of authority, and authority systems, especially opposing ones, which it is known that earlier in our history, our real-world history, religion and science clashed, I believe, and I'll just get straight to it. The scientists and the medical professionals, the experiments that were going on, were rubbing the church the wrong way. The church is mentioned. The church is definitely mentioned in Bloodborne's promotional material and its marketing. This curse that was brought upon the city, I don't believe it was either one's fault. I believe Hidetaka is going to strike that narrative note of it isn't either party's fault. There's no direct, obtuse, extremist commentary. Hidetaka is definitely not an extremist, even though his games are extremely hard. From a belief system point of view, there's a reason why his games have not caused major controversy. It ties in directly to the kind of man he is. He wouldn't put agendas in his games or anything. And much like Neil Blomkamp, I'll mention him recently, what with Chappie coming out, he has insisted multiple times that though his films tap into these perennial themes of humanity and the themes discussed, the primary purpose, the primary application for their creations is entertainment. And so, tying it into Bloodborne, there is few other things more entertaining and more enrapturing than the idea of this major conflict that happened between these belief systems, where one of them would have very well may have been throwing curses at the other or praying to their gods, and the scientists may have been doing their experiments on very likely the citizens of Yharnam. Hidetaka, it's very likely he may play the mysterious card and say and allude to how no one knows who won or what happened or who cursed who. It's very likely he'll take that route to maintain that juicy mystery. But this is a speculative story piece, so one possible interpretation is that the scientists started going too far with their experiments. The church tried to oppose them, and the scientists and the doctors, in opposition to being challenged, continued their experiments. This is a well-known aspect of I believe the late 1800s and the early 1900s. There were problems for doctors and medical staff in finding patients, in finding bodies to perform autopsies on, to literally just to learn their craft. It was very controversial. They had to do it under the cover of night with criminals. Often they had to collude with criminals with bringing them bodies because it was unsacred not to bury a body. That is another untapped aspect of the story, which I believe will be explored in Bloodborne. But this cleric has been transformed into a beast, and the natural conclusion we can come to is that in their pursuit for finding better remedies, possibly trying to achieve long life, or just messing with some mysterious dark stuff, is what the doctors were doing. And in what is quite likely going to be, if it is revealed, a tragic story, the cleric beast, the cleric, may himself have been protecting his church, protecting his flock of you can see them. You can see that when you are wandering around Bloodborne in that gameplay footage, that all of those hunters, what do they have in common? They all have an extended left arm, just like the cleric beast. Now, I don't want to get into too much spoilery territory, so I'll keep this speculative. But from a pure gameplay point of view, this immediately blared my eyes open and made me think that one of the main mechanics, one of the main narrative tools, and possibly a way of dividing up the story of Bloodborne, will be that the city has more than one, definitely more than one, knowing Miyazaki, of these bosses, I guess you could say. But the term boss refers to the head honcho, the main, the sort of, in this case what I'm referring to is the fact that I believe this cleric, even though he's repulsive, he's completely nightmarish and frightening. There's a mourning in his screech. You can tell that there was a human who was once there and who is now, because of who he was, because of his role, because of that conflict and whatever happened, possibly the doctors may have purposefully infected him. By the time the doctors were going insane and going crazy with their power, that this cleric would have gathered all of his flock, all of his people, protecting them from these compulsory, very Orwellian compulsory tests. It's very likely, in my mind, that the story could have taken a direction like that. Nothing is more terrifying than a doctor slowly walking towards you with a syringe, with a half-crazed look in his face, saying that this is for the progress of science. And if you're a devout religious person who opposes, there are many religions who oppose interfering with the natural shape, the natural ways of the body, and the natural cycle of life and death. It's no call, it's no beef at all, saying any judgment against scientists and the scientific mind, the inquiring mind. And you better believe that I'm so fundamentally aware throughout this that many people are just going to pick up Bloodborne and play it and enjoy it, and it's going to be lots of blood and splatters. That's great. In the meantime, this material is rich enough to read this level of symbology and meaning into it. I am certain the creators, including Hidetaka and the producers, would appreciate this level of analysis. And to be honest, this isn't getting into the incredibly obsessive or anything, the multi 5, 10, 15 part analyses that, trust me, they're out there for some things, not everywhere. But this is just 3-hour-long portions exploring these. 3 hours, and compare that to the hours of development, the hours, the days, the years of development of the story and the setting of Bloodborne. Come on. We all know that with that length of time, you spend time thinking about things. You spend time giving meaning and reading meaning into settings. And this is just speculation, but nevertheless, it's where my head is at with this story. I'll reveal it in a bullet point. I believe the cleric beast was transformed into what he was because of an insane posse of doctors, or possibly one figure who went insane and tried to protect his group of people, his loyal group of followers and devoted, flock. And obviously that did not go in his favor. He was transformed in what will likely, if there's ever any kind of flashback sequence, what will possibly, for each boss, there might be a flashback sequence about what happened and how they were transformed. Though that's entirely 100% speculative. Nothing confirmed with that. There would be an easy way to not just let the cleric beast be a bestial boss. His antlers, his countenance, which is another way of saying, is just his hollowed, completely nightmarish, permanently shrieking face. The left arm, the extended left arm, there has been some speculation on Reddit that it refers to the heart. It refers to how the disease sprung forth from the heart, and the heart pumps blood, and so blood-borne. The disease was blood-borne. A speculative assumption about the sequence in which this happens could be that the cleric, in a very sick, sadistic move, the cleric may have been infected without his knowledge infected with the curse, and he would be at a sermon with hundreds of people, maybe even a couple of hundreds of people, and that disease is bloodborne. There may have been some conflict there that caused from one to the other to become bestial, for him to have essentially transformed into a beast in a setting like that, not at a sermon, but with it being alluded to that the reason why everyone, so many people, now they're wandering around aimlessly in a quite a tragic kind of mockery of their devotion to the cleric beast and to the cleric and to their religion. They've become mindless drones. They've become, again, all sorts of commentary you can make there, won't be going into it too deeply about religion and such, and what the hunter represents. And deep symbology is definitely not what these videos are intended for and made for. But if I were to sort of condense the subtext of what I'm alluding to, is there is a cautionary tale possibly about not following the flock, and knowing that putting yourself in a position of being a mindless drone is very different to putting yourself in a position of being in communion with kindred spirits who are all each their own person, and with their own beliefs and their own personalities. Bloodborne completely throws that into this metaphorical setting where these very eerie, very creepy figures who, it's very likely, it's alluded to that they themselves, the hunters, at various stages turn into beasts. We can see, and I'll put a picture of it up now over what I'm saying, there is a design, there's an enemy type, which I believe in the trailers there's only been about 10 out of probably about 100 or so enemy types revealed. But you can see that there are half transformed, there are almost fully transformed humans, and that's powerful imagery, because those man beasts, I'm noticing that there aren't a lot of female of the the long-armed hunters seem all to be male. Granted, there could be commentary there, but essentially, I believe that was that's just something to do with the cuts of the trailers. I believe, that wasn't intentional or anything. There's definitely strong and prominent female characters in the Soul series. It won't be any different with Bloodborne. So, dialing it back to the setting, to the vignette, that beast, the cleric beast, is haunted by what he did, haunted by what happened, and he's become a mindless beast, and any affront to his small little kingdom of mourning is seen as an immediate threat, and he eviscerates anyone who comes close, and the hunter is no different. Because ostensibly, he's quite an agile beast, and so he would be jumping around, and seeing that there's this hunter about, there are these hunters about, and he's getting ready to defend his bridge that could very likely have led to his parish, to his church, to his place of dwelling as the cleric that he once was. So moving away from that, we're looking at, and by and large I think I will refer to my PDF for this if you want to bring that up and read along with this. But the hunter himself is very little, as I mentioned in the last video, there's very little to talk about with him, because he is you, and the character design is entirely going to be based on you. And I think in the latest trailers, there's going to be a lot of variety of how you can dress yourself, and usually dress is tied in with symbology, so there's very little I can touch there in terms of analysis and speculation. But the general premise for all players seems to be that they've come to Yharnam. The player has come to Yharnam looking for a cure. In my meta story within Bloodborne I believe it's called The Blood of the Beast. It's this, I believe it's going to be a 20-part story, which I'm up to about part 7 of drafting, and I've completed part 4 so far completely with illustrations. It's just been something to make out of the speculation and the research I've done between, working and study and other commitments. I enjoy speculating and infusing that into narrative and analysis videos, which that is what Tweety Gamer is an outlet for. So I hope you've enjoyed what has been put out so far, and I hope that you will enjoy what will be put out. Anyway, the hunter. Trench coats, dark, brooding figure. Mournful figure in some senses. He keeps his scarf up to his nose. This definitely connotates being diseased, being sick. It's a sick man. And if anything, and this is probably, couldn't be considered a spoiler because it's implied just by your surroundings that, and the encounter with Priest Gascoigne, who I will talk about a little bit soon, when I build out more into the world design, because this has been story speculation so far. It's implied that these characters are sick and that they go to Yharnam for this pilgrimage of sorts to find a cure. It's my belief, and this is expressed in the story, that this is essentially a ritualized suicide to attempt to go to Yharnam. They're accursed, sick people who have no other choice, and they've been given the death sentence and said that there's no other cure for their ailment, and their last recourse is Yharnam, this sort of imaginary city. If I was a film director, and if I was impossibly tasked with adapting Bloodborne into a film, the setup would be that, and it would be implied for me, that Bloodborne doesn't entirely take place inside someone's nightmare or inside someone's subconscious, but it can be played with in the way that Dario Argento used to do with illusion and nightmare and dream and what is what. That on the trip to Yharnam, it could be implied that the traveller simply dies, and that their last nightmare is Yharnam. And it is a fevered nightmare, it is a cursed nightmare, and from that nightmare they slip into death. When I think of the dream refuge, that is possibly the singular most intriguing aspect of this title, figuring out why, if you die in Bloodborne, why are you transported to a peaceful lodge, and why can you return to the real world with items and weapons that you picked up from the lodge, from the hunter's refuge. It's I have no idea how to think of it, unless the entire thing is a dream. Anyway, we'll have to look into that. Maybe in the third video, or maybe leave it as it is and just experience the title in a little under a week, I believe, is where we're up to now in waiting for the title. So that is a large portion of the speculation on the story, and it was using a vignette, but that by and large painted the backstory of Yharnam, possibly what happened before and led to Yharnam becoming what it was. There is so much that is nebulous, so much that is still up in the air, that all of this speculation might be moot. Obviously, all speculation is moot once a title comes out, but that's not why we speculate. We speculate because it sort of sets our imaginations on fire, and it engages us, and it gets us to think about it, and then have a basis to compare the story to, and to compare what the actual experience was to what we thought it was, and to be able to explore that and discuss that. So that vignette, to me, is incredibly descriptive. It may have just been an exciting action sequence to a lot of people, but there were so many things. And I'll tap into the statues just very briefly. These statues seem to be warped by the curse of Yharnam. That is what happens in nightmares. And if you've seen Doctor Who, we all know that frightening statues, they have a supernatural influence on them. Usually statues they aren't made to frighten. That's very unusual for especially anything outside of gargoyles, or typically, purposeful, smaller sculptures that in the convention of gargoyles, that's just done as an architectural feature. But these statues are genuinely mourning. There's weeping statues. But even further, even more than what we see, we have weeping statues. We have La Pietà, which I'll show a picture of now. Of course, there are mourning statues. There are eye-bleeding statues and all that. But in line with how Yharnam is essentially a twisted nightmare version of the world, these statues seem to be like, there's movement in their robes, there's straining, there's fear, there's pain. Reminds me of the sequence from, and don't ask me how, it's just possibly a vibe thing, of the sequence in Fantasia with the large demon and those cavorting little demonettes in his hand, and that cursed city straining against, their bonds. It is an incredibly evocative image, and to see them holding up these candles as well, I believe there are some sequences with that as well. The giants scene, the giants in the church, there could be endless speculation on who all of these creatures once were, but I am too aware of how close we are to release to explore that any further, and I don't believe it would do anyone any good to go too far into speculation, because initial light speculation is quite good, but constructing entire theories, that can sometimes be a bit self-sabotaging, so we won't go into that. Needless to say, these statues have me incredibly intrigued. The link to the Hunter's Lodge and to the messengers is incredibly intriguing, and I explore that in my narrative. It's something explorative that I'm doing in the PDF to wonder about possibly what all the statues might do if you stop in front of them. I don't know if the hunter will be able to pray to them and get stat bonuses or anything symbolic for the story to represent, his different attributes, as is the case with RPGs. There are endless things to speculate upon about those, but I'll digress on the statues, I believe. Now, discussing the potential plot of the story itself, because we've only explored essentially the background of one character, the cleric beast, of Priest Gascoigne, of the Raven Hunter, who there are some allusions that the Raven Hunter is simply another player, but in one of the gameplay videos, which I'll be trying to play in the background of this one, it is a female. She talks very self-assuredly to the hunter about arriving in Yharnam and being in Yharnam and what it means. Those conversations that you can have with people behind their closed doors, which is a phenomenally evocative idea and gameplay mechanic. It essentially means almost every building, at least that you can access by the street, that has a light on, could be a potential insight into the story. It's an incredibly cozy image to think of, even though the person inside is probably dying or incredibly frightened. It's that idea of just a moonless sky, or not a moonless, a starless sky, and dangers on every street, being outside and locking yourself inside with a candle, boarding yourself up and just waiting for the sun that will never come. Incredibly evocative. But the hunter has a sickness, is there, the protagonist is there to find a cure, or to experience a nightmare, or to experience something that could be an exploration of a psychological issue or a mental health issue. But that, to keep in line with Dark Souls, I believe there are many cases that can be made of Dark Souls, metaphorically, but without getting too heady, without getting too over-intellectualized. The story will probably center around the hunter looking for his cure, asking people, what the next step is, what the next section can be to find more clues. And I believe on the way to finding your cure, you'll discover deeper intrigues. You may even discover from the Priest Gascoigne, that there is no cure. There could be some twist like that, and that the entire thing is a projected nightmare from some ancient deity sleeping somewhere, and he has everyone caught up in his own nightmare, in his own dream, and Yharnam could be this thing that souls become trapped in on their way to the afterlife. All sorts of intriguing things. It's one of the main reasons I'm greatly looking forward to this title. Now, that wraps up some aspects of we sort of dovetailed from a small section on setting to a small discussion. It was a pretty prominent discussion on the cleric beast and some story speculation. I think I might round off this Tweedy cast with some discussion about the world design and some speculative. This is very exciting for me because I myself am a designer. I design abstract patterns that have a lot of, I won't say menacing shapes or macabre shapes, but a lot of my shapes have a sort of brambled and thorned look to them. And when I look at those trees of Bloodborne, the sickness of those trees, how purely Bram Stokian the whole picture, the Hemwick graveyard, and the approach with the carrion crows, which I'm not sure if the narrative, as is the case with my story, it does begin outside of Yharnam with some flashbacks to the hunter's past life. If it does begin there, nothing would be more of a joy than to approach Yharnam, than to begin outside of Yharnam. But, as we can see by the 18 minutes of gameplay, it's likely that you begin within Yharnam. It's very likely. But that's what speculation is for, and these videos are for. I'll focus on two locations. The Hemwick graveyards with those witches. Oh, those witches. And the graveyard within the city, which I believe is where Priest Gascoigne is, because I believe there are two different graveyards. Because it says something about Yharnam that there are multiple graveyards. There were multiple casualties, multiple deaths this struggle between the church and the doctors, and we can even say the blood administrators, will refer to them as that in this and the subsequent video. They, and also the woman with the veil and the bell, they intrigue me. They intrigue me on a level which I feel as though may mean, along with Gyula, I believe Gyula is key to the story. By the way, Gyula's name refers to, I believe it's a Hungarian name or a Transylvanian name. I think it's a title for some kind of leader. So, and that ties into how Gyula is an experienced and veteran hunter. So definitely look that up in the PDF which I've put together, which I'm still putting together, by the way. Hemwick Graveyards. I'm not sure if you saw the film Witches, the Disney film, incredibly terrifying Disney film. Witches, graveyards, those shrieking witches. I mean, there's obviously an increased stylization on the witches within Hemwick Graveyards, and they seem to be completely psychotic. Well, I don't know, usually witches can be sometimes quite sinister, and they sort of lurk in the shadows, and they move quite slowly, but they are insane with their sickles and their screaming. In some ways, it reminds me of some of the enemies, and I haven't even talked about this, but I was a massive player of a title called Medieval back in 1998, and Bloodborne ties into that. I actually grew up in a small Italian village called Montefiore, and it's changed a little bit since when I lived there, but cobblestone streets, gaslight lamps, midnight, seeing the moon shine off the cobblestones that have just had rain on them. It's something that's sort of in my blood, really, and it sort of evokes sort of my childhood a little bit, and this game Medieval. Now, these monsters in Medieval they were insane. They attacked you, they barreled towards you. There was I believe it was a level called the Scarecrow Fields. There were literally, I think it was it was a farmer who came at you with a pitchfork and with a sickle and just went for it and went just like trying to dice you up, Excuse me. And that insane, like they used to pop out of bales of hay, and it was just terrifying. And Bloodborne is absolutely harkening back to and giving recognition to those titles where literally enemies they're relentless. Compare it with the Order's werewolves who hang back and they strategize and they act like real animals. A lot of these enemy types, they're relentless, which is very much taps into the old NES titles like Castlevania, and absolutely. And so, from a narrative point of view, though, it's very likely that because witches are magical creatures, and they were probably very closely involved or closely cognizant of what's happening on a magical level with Yharnam, and sort of the nightmare of Yharnam was caused by, I believe, as I mentioned earlier, the clash between the church and the blood administration, the blood administrators. And so witches, probably who lived in the woods around Hemwick, would have had the curse either being born from the curse or were pre-existing, and that the curse simply drove them insane because of how attuned. I'm referring obviously to how it's very likely that the doctors and the church tapped into some very dark black magic that possibly comes from another dimension, that a disease like what seems to have overtaken the plague that has overtaken Bloodborne very much feels like it could have come from some Cthulhian alternate dimension, which drives people insane, especially the minds of people who are particularly attuned with the ether. And it is a very roundabout way of wondering and speculating why those witches are as insane as they are. Absolutely. And they just seem to have been hermits that have gone insane, and they attack anyone who comes close, and it's very likely that they're successful in how many people they kill because they're still alive, and they seem like basically almost like mindless wights. Either that, or they're interested in taking you back to their little witch hovels and splitting you apart and, sacrificing your body parts to some ancient deities, something like that. So, and that could be said of the eyeball witch as well, who I have some theories about, which are explored in the PDF. Second enemy I will mention, and we're tying this off soon, we'll try and make this an hour as well, last 5 minutes. Talk a little bit about Priest Gascoigne. I had some speculation. It seems to be just a common name, Gascoigne, French, obviously, in origin. Everything about his body language implies that he's been there for a while and that he has succumbed to the curse of the beast, and for better or worse, he's decided to embrace it. He is an incredibly narratively intriguing character to me, because if he is a priest of the church and he has become a beast and he has almost embraced it to a degree, where he's able to help you on the bridge if you let him, that intrigues me. And seeing that he is still hanging about the graveyard, which is a significant place for priests because they're often called upon for the final rites, and that could be his mini parish. He could be, for all intents, a cleric beast in the making. Who knows? He seems to be on his way, but especially when he transforms in the trailer, as we've seen. Incredibly intriguing. And I'm keen to see how he relates to Gula, as I believe there could be a link there. It's implied in the marketing material that Gula lives in the old part of Yharnam, and it's likely because of his age and his bearing and his title. It's a very sort of knowing wink to the fact that, just like the cleric in Cleric Beast is referring to what happened before he became a beast, and the priest in Priest Gascoigne is referring to that as well, what happened back then. It's incredibly intriguing. So, anyway, I think we'll tie up the podcast with a few more minutes and just discussing the plan for the channel and the plan for the next post. Now, the next post, I'm just honing in on what would be the best use of another hour of discussing Bloodborne for anyone listening at work, if they just want to immerse themselves in speculation about this very evocative title. I'll have that up either shortly after this one, because I definitely don't want to leave you guys waiting for more content, especially since this stuff sort of naturally spills from me. It's just a byproduct of me making all this research. But so that's going to be happening quite soon. And so for the plan for the channel, there will be a few more podcasts, but there definitely will be a few videos as well coming up as well, including an unboxing video of the Nightmare Edition, which I believe I'll link obviously that video. I'll link this one all into one playlist so that it's very easy for you to sort of listen from the beginning, from Tweedycast from 1, 2, and 3, and then into the unboxing. And anything further I have to add to that. It's likely, depending on what you guys think, and I want you to let me know in the comments, if you want me to make a series of videos, either in podcast form or in video form, if you want me to make some videos about the story that I'm writing, The Blood of the Beast, if that's something that you would like for me to narrate in a sort of Vincent Priceian kind of way, I might even see if I can include include a fireplace. Hint, hint, it'll probably just be a soundtrack, or a sound sampling that I'll find. I'm more than happy to do that if you guys would like. And I might end up doing it anyway because it sounds like a great idea and it might encourage me to write the rest of the story. I'll have it all outlined and everything. So, anyway, I have been Tweedy Gamer. It has been my pleasure to make this second video for the Bloodborne series. It's an incredibly intriguing title. I've mentioned it several times, and there is something about Hidetaka and what he's doing now with this title which just tells me that he's about to step out into a wider sphere of appreciation, and especially with his plans for the online component, which I believe there will be lots of DLC. He may even tease us out and keep some of the story till DLC, so I'm intrigued about that as well. Anyway, yes, I've been Tweety Gamer, and please enjoy part 3 coming soon. Bye now.